In this video, I'll be showing a Holman Bible from 1989. It is Holman's UltraThin Reference Bible in the 1984 New International Version. This particular copy is in brown bonded leather. Here's the box. UltraThin Reference Bible. It's a two-piece box. There is the ISBN. I also have here a burgundy genuine leather copy of the same Bible, Holman UltraThin 1984 NIV. Green is a little bit different. Color, of course, is different, but otherwise pretty much identical. I'm going to show you this one because this one's mine. This was lent to me just for comparison purposes for the video. To give you a sense for the dimensions, here is a NIV wide margin hardback from Zondervan from the 1980s, which is a much larger Bible. By the way, these are 66-book Protestant Bibles. This is essentially the NIV Study Bible, but it's a Lutheran edition where the notes have been adjusted slightly to accommodate Lutheran understandings. So it's much thinner than the NIV Study Bible. This is a large print NIV Study Bible. I believe this dates from the 1990s, but it is a fairly large font in it. I think it's 11 or 12 points. I may show this in a Bible review at some point, but it dwarfs the thin line that we'll be looking at today. In terms of dimensions, the book is 8 7/8 inches tall, 6 inches wide, and 8/10 of an inch thick. On the inside, you'll see that the text is laid out into 2 columns, paragraph by paragraph format. Each column is 49 millimeters wide and on a line that has little white space and a lot of letters closely spaced. I count about 40 characters. There are as many as 65 lines top to bottom on a page where there are no breaks, such as in the column on the left on this page. The page dimensions: 214 millimeters top to bottom and 142 millimeters left to right, so that's about 8.4 inches tall, 5.6 inches wide. The margins are narrow at the top, 11 to 13 millimeters. Remember, there are 25.4 millimeters in an inch. The inner margin can be as much as 11, but it's less than this here in the center of the book. The outer margin ranges between 10 and 13 millimeters, and then at the bottom of the page, from the bottom edge of notes or text to the edge, is 8 to 10 millimeters. So very, very narrow margins all around. Text is definitely not line matched here. You can see that by looking at the text almost anywhere. You can see print from the opposite side of the page coming through. Pronouns for deity here are not in capital letters. For instance, here, we're in John 17. After Jesus said this, he looked. So you see the H in he is not in capitals. Words of Christ in this particular edition are in black ink, the way I prefer it. The text is not self-pronouncing, so you will not see marks over proper names or place names that tell you how to pronounce it. There's no key in the front to explain what pronunciation symbols mean. In the Old Testament, it uses the standard the Lord rather than Yahweh. There are headings in the text. Headings, let's find one. Headings are a bit larger than the font itself. The heading here is in about a 10-point italic font, and quite frequently in the NIV, when you see the heading just below it, you'll see convenient references to parallel or similar passages. There are also page bottom notes, text and translation notes here, for instance. These are in about a 7-point font. One of the interesting things here is that you tell the difference between these notes, text and translation notes, and the references, which are both indicated in the text with characters, raised characters, is that the characters that indicate text and translation notes are standard, whereas the characters that indicate references are in italics. So if you see one that's straight up and down, it's a reference in the bottom corner of the page. If it is an italic character like this G, then it refers to the center column references. Center column references are designed in such a way that they map back. They're in column order, so they don't line up very closely to the text, but they're not that hard to find because you have a nice bold chapter and verse reference in the center column, and you can read them backwards. You can go from a particular reference here in the center column reference back into the text itself. Books of the Bible do not begin on a fresh page. So 1 Timothy began where 2 Thessalonians left off. When we come to the end of the book of Hebrews, we go to James, and at the end of James starts on a fresh page, but at the end of James we come to 1 Peter. 2 Peter starts on a fresh page, but 1 John does not. One of the interesting things about this, we'll talk about the paperweight in a minute, but as you can tell, it's very thin. This is not a Bible that's easy to navigate. For instance, if you want to find one of the minor prophets, for instance, it's very difficult to flip through the pages one-handed and find just the book that you're looking for. Because the paper is so thin, it is quite floppy. But we'll talk about paper in a minute. Book titles are in the outside top of the page. Page contents are there as well. So the first full verse on this page is 939 in Luke. And page numbers are here. Now this is a good arrangement. I like having the book title and the chapter and verse here in the outside because that does make it easier to navigate through the Bible. Verse numbers are within the paragraph. They're very small and they're somewhat difficult to find. You do have the clutter caused by the verse references in there as well that make it a little bit more challenging. The chapter numbers are large and bold. They span about 2 lines of text. I characterize the print here as black, sharp, but not especially bold. As you would expect in a Bible printed in about 1989, there is print non-uniformity, and I've selected this page because the very next page is much lighter. So this is 675, and if we pull out 677, you can see the variation. And as I mentioned, this is not at all uncommon. A very dark page followed by a relatively light page. Not so light as not to be usable, but much lighter than what I would prefer, which is the page on the left. When I compare the font to Times New Roman, the capital letters seem like they're about 8.5. Some of them are perhaps as large as 9 points in height. Lowercase letters generally are about the same size as a 9-point Times New Roman. Line spacing here, from baseline to baseline, is 2.99 millimeters. That's the equivalent of 8.5 points. Let's talk a bit about the paper. The sheet thickness is 25 micrometers. I estimate the paperweight at 22.9 GSM, so it's probably 22 GSM. It's older paper, so you won't find a sheen on the surface, which you very often find in Bibles printed today. There's sort of a dull glare, but you don't get that shininess to it. The color is creamish. let's call it a cream tinge. Whether that's from age or not, I'm not sure. Show through can be somewhat distracting, and words can be read right through the paper. We mentioned earlier that it is not line matched, and show through can be somewhat distracting since this thin paper is not particularly opaque. You can read the references on the next center column over, right between the references printed on this page. Now, in terms of study assistance, apart from the text and translation notes and the center column references, which I enjoy using, I very much like using center column references when I study the Bible. You have a table of weights and measures that takes up one page essentially, and that gives you another sense for the opacity of the paper. You can read that quite easily from the other side of the page. You can read introduction here through this page, title page to the Concordance. The Concordance spans 72 pages. It's in 3 columns. It says that there are about 2,000 word entries with about 13,000 context lines. The 3 columns, the text here is about a 6.5 points, so it's a little small. If you have older eyes like mine, you may need to use a magnifying glass, or if you're like me, take your eyeglasses off and use your highly nearsighted naked eyes. After the Concordance, we come to some color maps. They're on glossy paper, very shiny. They do not enter the gutter. There are 8 pages of these maps altogether. I'm not quite sure how to count them, since some of them are broken up here. This could be counted as 3 maps, I suppose, and this could be counted as 4. They're very, very colorful. Not a lot of detail here. And we're about to talk about the binding in a moment, so while we're here, I'll just show you. Hope that shows up. Or maybe if I turn off one of these lamps, it'll show up better. You can see in the gutter there the threads. Perhaps it works better with the lamps on. Not sure. So I've definitely sewn. I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines of stitching. Now, I should mention that there's a more recent version of this that was printed in the 1990s that's glued, and it has a more narrow line spacing. So while I'm talking about that, let me show it to you. I found this red Holman NIV in a used bookstore. It is a little shorter than the one we're reviewing, not quite as wide. And if you look at the text in it, you'll see that it isn't quite as tall. That is, the line spacing is more narrow. So this the font is essentially the same size in both of these, and the one we're reviewing on the right, and in this one on the left. This one is also glued. This is a glued binding. And if you look at the front, you'll see that this is printed in Belgium. This particular one was 1999. If you look through the list of ISBNs here, you will see the same ISBN that you saw earlier on the genuine leather Holman from 1989. So I think it's somewhat important that you know when the Bible is printed. The later printings seem to be glued and not sewn, and to have tighter line spacing, although this particular copy is printed rather darkly and it's fairly nice. But the point is that you can have 2 different Bibles with the same ISBN. So returning to our bonded leather Bible from 1989 with sewn binding, we see that we have a paste-off construction with a coated paper liner. We have red and gold head and tail bands. I think you can see those in there. There's 1 brown ribbon marker. Ribbon marker is 7 millimeters wide, 29 centimeters long. That's 11.4 inches long. And it comes out It's a reasonable extension beyond the corner, so it's usable. We mentioned the sewn binding, and we'll take a look to see how it lies, whether it lies open or not, and whether it's flat, whether the text is flat to the eye in Genesis. And as you can see, it's going to be. There's Genesis 4, Genesis 2, Genesis 1. I'll zoom in a bit so that you can look at the gutter. There's some drop off here. You can flatten it out fairly nicely. Let's go deeper in to see if we have a drop off issue. There's some curvature here, but it's not hard to press it flat on either side so that you can have a flat surface while you're reading. So I would say it lies open and reasonably flat. I'll let you have another look at the brown bonded leather cover. The bonded leather and the genuine leather in that red genuine leather edition, they feel very similar. There's not much difference between them in terms of flexibility. This is actually, the genuine leather one is actually a bit stiffer and it feels thicker. But other than that, not much difference at all. Genuine leather is not particularly good leather. Gold page edges, not gold over red, but just gold. And as we come into the front, you'll see a presentation page on glossy paper, blank page, certificate of marriage, births, marriages, occasions to remember, and then deaths. You have a half leaf, the full title page, Holman Bible Publishers, Nashville. That's in Tennessee in the United States, called the UltraThin Reference Bible. And here is the copyright page, copyright 1986. This is the 1984 New International Version. That's different from the 2011 one, which is commonly sold today. The major difference is that the 2011 uses what's called gender-neutral language. I think the old language is actually relatively neutral from a gender perspective, since grammatically masculine pronouns were used in a gender-inclusive way in the old days. But it's not understood that way today. And here is the printing information. This is a first edition from 1986. You'll see that the paper has warped a bit. I'm not sure what caused that. That's the kind of thing you get from moisture occasionally, but if a drop of water had actually fallen on this paper, it would be far more wrinkled than that. Here's the table of contents, Old Testament, New Testament. This is definitely a 66 book Bible. Table of contents in alphabetical order. If you need to find a page number to find a book of the Bible, this is the page to go to. There's the preface to the NIV. We won't spend any time on that. Preface is dated June of 78, revised in August of 83. Single page separating the Old Testament from the preface, and we are in Genesis. Before we go on to the font comparisons, I'll give you another close-up look at this font. I think it's nicely spaced in terms of the distance from baseline to baseline. It's fairly easy on the eyes. The column is not too wide. So all together, I think it's a good layout. On the left now you see the font in the more modern Holman UltraThin Reference Bible in the NIV that I showed you a few moments ago. This essentially has the same font, but a tighter line spacing. Printed a bit better, I think, but harder to read because of that tightness, the closeness of the lines. Now on the left you see essentially the font in the NIV Study Bible. This is the Lutheran version of the NIV Study Bible that I showed you at the beginning of the video. On the left now you'll see the large print NIV Study Bible, which I also showed you at the beginning of the video. Much larger font, much easier on the eyes, especially old eyes. Now on the left you see the Cambridge Cameo. This is a King James Version Bible, similar size of the font. I brought in on the left now the ESV Creeds and Confessions, which I think is essentially the same as the ESV Omega. It's a Crossway Bible. And finally on the left you see the font in the MacArthur Study Bible. This is the Comfort Print font for the New American Standard. I'll say a bit about the translation, beginning by showing you my translation Continuum, where I show the more literal translations to the left and the less literal to the right. I should point out that literalness is not the same as accuracy. I explain how I measure literalness in the method section on the lower left-hand side of the chart. You see the 84 NIV there in blue, about 2/3 of the way to the right. It's more literal than some translations, like the New Living Translation and the Jerusalem Bibles, the revised and the New English Bibles. A little bit more literal than the 2011 NIV, but it is much less literal than many English translations, like the New American Standard Family, the English Standard Version, and the New Revised Standard Version. I examined the Old Testament in 100 spots to see how it departed from the Masoretic Text. The 84 NIV does that 27 times. The 2011 NIV does it 28 times. They differed in only 3 spots in the 100 verses. Next, I'd like to characterize the New Testament textual basis. I do that using a method I explained in a video that I published in November 2019 entitled A Four-Dimensional Perspective on Bible Translations. So I'll show you 4 quad charts, beginning with this one, which shows the Nestle-Aland 28th edition on the Y or vertical axis, Robinson-Pierpont's Byzantine text form on the X or horizontal axis. And so the higher up the Bible appears on the chart, the more it agrees with Nestle-Aland. The farther to the right it is on the chart, the more it agrees with Robinson-Pierpont. The 1984 NIV you see in the red box about the center of the chart, but far to the left. It, compared with other translations, it's about middle of the road in terms of percentage of agreement with Nestle-Aland, and it does not agree with Robinson-Pierpont's distinctive readings very often at all. The next chart is kind of a mirror image of that, because on the x-axis I've replaced Robinson-Pierpont with Westcott and Hort, and so the translations essentially move. The ones that were far to the right are now far to the left, because translations that agree with Robinson-Pierpont frequently disagree with Westcott and Hort frequently. So you see it's again in terms of the vertical position, it's still in the middle of the pack, and it's fairly far to the right now because it doesn't agree very much with Robinson-Pierpont. It does agree fairly often with Westcott and Hort, but not as often as, say, the New American Standard translations. NAS 20, NAS 77, NAS 95, LSB off there to the right. Next chart is Westcott and Hort versus Robinson-Pierpont. And on this chart, a lot of the translations come closer together. They're high in terms of Westcott and Hort agreement and low in terms of Robinson-Pierpont agreement. So they kind of cluster well on this chart. And you see the NIV 84 up there, a little bit high towards the middle in the red box. Very low agreement again with Robinson-Pierpont. And finally, I added the Tyndale House Greek New Testament. I plotted it here on the X or horizontal axis. Agreement with Tyndale House is not especially strong for the 1984 NIV. I used the NIV a bit back in the 1980s, and I always found it to be very readable, but a somewhat bland translation. I know of one lady who won't read anything else. She says she can't understand any translation except the NIV. Now, I will take you to a few specific passages, and we'll look at the way the NIV translates them. I'll start with Psalm 51:5. In the King James Version, that reads, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." The NIV has, "Surely I was sinful at birth," and a number of people dislike that. If we look at Romans chapter 7 and 8, you'll see that the NIV often translates the Greek word sarx with sinful nature. You see that here in chapter 8, verses 3, 4, 5, and then if I pan down a bit, you'll see it again in verse 8, down here. Sinful nature. If you go down to the footnote, you'll see that they acknowledge that the normal translation is the flesh. When I read sinful nature here, what it causes me to wonder is, are they implying that we have one single nature that is a sin nature? Or are they saying that we have multiple natures, one of which is sinful? So that's a little puzzling, and I'm sure other people disagree with it for theological reasons. One thing I do like about what the NIV does here is translate this Greek word dikaiomata as righteous requirement. I like that, and I see that other translations do that as well these days. In Galatians 1, 8 and 9, we see that the word anathema is translated as eternally condemned here at the end of 8 and again at 9. Normally, translations just use the original term anathema, but the NIV has decided to translate it as eternally condemned. I think a number of people probably object to that translation. I would think those who believe in universal salvation and annihilationism would. In John 1:18, the NIV has, "No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known." So that seems to indicate that the Son alone is God, and it implies then that the Father is not. At least that's one way of reading it. For some people, keeping the numerical values the same as in the original language is important. They often point here to John 2:6. This translation has changed the units, and so it's changed the numerical values also. So it now reads 20 to 30 gallons, but at least the footnote at the bottom of the page explains to you that the original said 2 to 3 metrites. Now we just saw the words 20 and 30 spelled out. I think the NIV may have been one of the first English translations to use numerals in the text. So here that's what's going on in Revelation 7. The translation we've been reviewing here is the 1984 New International Version. In 2011, it was revised to adopt a gender-inclusive approach. It particularly changes pronouns. It pluralizes some pronouns that were previously singular and grammatically male. So we'll take a look at a few passages and show you how the NIV changed from 1984 to 2011. Charts will be in this form. You see one here for John 14:23. Pay attention to the bottom half of the chart. The upper half gives you Greek on the upper left, and the 1971 Revised Standard Version, which is pretty much in standard mid-20th century English, in the upper right. But pay attention to the bottom two quadrants. On the right is the 84, and on the left is the 2011. And you see what's happened here. The 1984 is a bit more literal in that it has an if that is present in the Greek, which the 2011 has removed. The pronouns are all masculine singular in the Greek, like him that you see in the English of the lower right, but the 2011 changed that to them. So it's actually using them as if it's singular, because anyone grammatically is singular. Another example is here in 1 Corinthians 14:4. The 84 NIV had he who speaks. That was changed in 2011 to anyone who. I think both are just fine. The 2011 replaced a himself with themselves. So himself is actually grammatically the same as what you see in the upper left in the Greek. And then another he who becomes the one who. And again, to me, that is not important, but the change from a singular pronoun to a plural formed pronoun that's supposed to be singular just sort of grates at my nerves. Another example here is here at John 11:25, where the 84 NIV, the one we're looking at, is closer to the Greek grammatically than the more gender-inclusive 2011. In Romans 4:5, we have the word man appearing in the 84 NIV, and that is not in the Greek, so I like its removal in the 2011, but I still prefer his to there, particularly since his is literally what the Greek says. In Luke 10:6, the 84 NIV says a man of peace. It's actually more literally a son of peace, which either one I think is better than someone who promotes peace, which is what the 2011 has. And then we have the pronoun issue again. The Greek literally has a Greek equivalent of him, not the plural formed them, which is intended to be singular. In 1 John 5:16, the first half of the verse, we see the 2011 NIV replacing brother with brother or sister. It also got rid of the pronoun, the possessive pronoun his, and just put any in there. The brother or sister I don't mind, because that's the way I understand brother in the passage. It means either a brother or a sister, but replacing his with any is rather loose. The other change it makes here, and you see in blue, is that it changes a third person verb and replaces it with a second person verb, which again is loose. I don't think you lose any meaning here, but it is less literal. And then of course you have the him to them transformation later, where them is intended to be singular. We have something of the same story here in Matthew 18:15. Brother replaced with brother or sister, I don't have an issue with that, but replacing him with their, he listens with they listen, and it actually, the 2011 removed the word brother entirely and replaced it with them. I do prefer the 84 NIV in these sorts of passages. In Hebrews 5:1, you see that the word men appears in the 84 NIV, but it's replaced with the people in the 2011. Men actually is fairly literally what the Greek says there. The 84 took sort of a loose approach to translating what you see in blue there, I think, just to avoid repeating the word men in the verse. The 2011 had no problem with repeating the people. And so those are a few examples that show that the 84 NIV in general used what was standard English before people became as sensitive as they are today to ensuring that their language isn't interpreted as excluding certain types of people. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this look at the 1984 NIV Holman UltraThin Reference Bible. It's well made, sewn binding, good paper. Print quality is not quite as good as what you would typically find these days, but you don't have the paper sheen. Unfortunately, there's no line matching, but I think the real advantage to this Bible is that it is very small and lightweight. This is extremely portable. It is readable as long as your eyes are young enough. 8.5, 9-point font is small. I would reiterate that you need to be careful if you're looking for one of these online. It appears that the editions that were printed in the 80s have more line spacing than the ones printed in the 90s, as in that example I showed you, and showed you again in the font comparison section. The NIV itself is highly readable. It is somewhat, I would call it bland. It's not very sensational, spicy in any particular way, but it is generally an accurate translation. Some people, we've noted, accuse it of somewhat Augustinian / Calvinistic bias, and that wouldn't be very surprising, since I believe it was first translated under the guidance of the Christian Reformed Church. So thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this hopefully not too long, overly long video. Remember to like video, share it on social media, and I always encourage you to subscribe to the channel if you're so inclined. Thank you very much for watching.